Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Good afternoon, thank you for coming. I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's George P. Smith II Visiting Distinguished Chair Lecture. Whether students intend to practice in southern Indiana or in a major hub like New York or London, it's important, we think, at the law school for students to get a bit of understanding of the world around them. We do that in a number of ways, whether that's from having one of the oldest LLM programs in the country, to our Stewart Fellows Global Internship Program, to the efforts our students and faculty do in the Center for the Global Legal Profession, or with the Center on Constitutional Democracy, for faculty and students that are working in the International Law Society and in the general area of international law and international relations, and the deep partnerships we've established with schools throughout the country. But one of the cornerstones of our efforts to internationalize and expose students to ideas about the global world is through lectures like this. And the cornerstone of those endowed lectures as it relates to international law is this event, a yearly lecture from the George P. Smith Visiting Distinguished Chair. The Smith Chair was established specifically to bring exceptional scholars and practitioners of international law to our school each year as a way to broaden our students' exposures to scholars and judges of both national and international reputation. Its benefactor, George P. Smith II, is a 1964 graduate of the school. He's a long-standing faculty member at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., where he's a scholar of both domestic and international law and a pioneer in the interdisciplinary study of law, science, and medicine. Professor Smith deeply understands the importance of understanding globalization of law. If you haven't seen it, you should stop by the library where there's a large picture of Professor Smith. And we're very fortunate that Professor Smith here has joined us today, and I hope you'll join me in a round of applause to thank him for putting on this lecture. Due to Professor Smith's generosity, we've been able to bring in leading scholars for this lecture for many years. It includes the Honorable Michael Kirby, Judge of the High Court of Australia, Professor Harold Koh, former Dean of Yale Law School, Professor at Yale and former legal advisor of the U.S. State Department, and most recently Joan Donoghue, the U.S. member of the International Court of Justice. Today we are honored to continue that grand tradition of hosting the world's leading scholars by welcoming Professor I. Glenn Cohen from Harvard Law School. Professor Cohen is one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of bioethics and law, as well as health law. He has spoken at legal, medical, and industry conferences around the world and currently serves as the faculty director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. Much more important from my perspective, he teaches civil procedure. Professor Cohen has long been an overachiever. I'm jealous. He was the youngest professor on the faculty at Harvard Law School, both when he joined the faculty in 2008 and when he was tenured as a full professor in 2013. He's the author of a number of leading books in the area of health law and more than 80 articles and chapters written in that area. His award-winning work has appeared in leading legal, medical, scientific, and public health journals. He's also filed a number of amicus briefs and leading cases before the United States Supreme Court. He is one of 3 editors-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Biosciences, a peer-reviewed journal published by Oxford University, and serves on the editorial board for a number of other journals, including the American Journal of Bioethics. Prior to becoming a law professor, he served as a law clerk to Judge Michael Boonen of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. As a lawyer for the Department of Justice, he holds a J.D. from Harvard and a B.A. in Bioethics, Philosophy, and Psychology from the University of Toronto. It's incredibly fortunate to have Professor Cohen here today as our latest Smith Lecture, and I hope you'll join me in a warm welcome.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is that mic volume good? Great. Well, thank you to the Dean and the faculty for having me, and thank you to Professor Smith. You know, a lot of these endowed lectures are given as bequests for those who are deceased. This one isn't, which has 2 implications. The first implication is it shows that George is a person of amazing foresight and generosity. He's a friend and someone whose work I very much admire. The second implication I'm a little more ambivalent about, which is if I don't do a good job today, I'm going to get an earful from him afterwards. So hopefully we won't have to have one of those please clap, instructions at the end of my talk today. We'll find out. So disclosures. First of all, I've done a a little bit of consulting occasionally for people considering investing in the medical tourism industry. Always good to have your disclosures out there. So my topic today is the globalization of healthcare. And, why is healthcare globalizing? Well, healthcare expenditures in the United States in 2015 were forecasted to be about $3.207 trillion. The U.S. population is about $320 million, so that's roughly $10,000 per person. Using 2014 data, that was roughly about 17.5% of our GDP being spent on healthcare, projected to rise sharply as our population ages. If these costs were to continue to grow at historical rates, by 2040 it would be 34% of our GDP spent on this particular item, which means that actually, as many of you know, entering the workforce, a smaller share of our benefits are in take-home pay, more shifted to health insurance and the like. This also has huge implications for government programs, Medicare, Medicaid spending. The projection is that would rise to nearly 15% of GDP just from those programs in 2040. And 1/4 of that increase is due to the estimated aging of the population, which the demographic trends may change. And we have the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, hoping to bend the cost curve a little bit. But the reality is we're not going to bend it 180 degrees, essentially. So how have we dealt with these kinds of cost increases in other areas of the economy? One solution has been globalization. In 1817, David Ricardo, the British economist, and one of the most important insights in history, the theory of comparative advantage, a fundamental argument in favor of free trade. Ricardo argues that there is mutual benefit from trade or exchange, even if one party, the resource-rich country, the sophisticated artisan, is more productive in every possible way than is their trading counterpart, as long as each concentrates in the activities where they have a relative productivity advantage. So the theory has been put to work in basically almost all the products we consume. The suit I'm wearing, my iPad, even the food we consume, lots of it has been produced in some form or another through a globalized production change. But the one holdout industry for a very long time was healthcare. Healthcare was always produced and consumed locally. But in the last 20 years, and certainly in the last 10 years in particular, that's begun to change. What I want to talk about is that change in this lecture. So there are different kinds of globalization. I'm going to focus on 3 in this talk: medical tourism, medical migration, and medical repatriation, and examine them from the lens of global justice and global law. But there's many others I could talk about: telemedicine, global R&D. Those would be 2 of the first ones I would turn to beyond these. Talk's going to be long on questions but short on answers, but luckily we have the Q&A session. Normally in a traditional Q&A, you ask the Q's and I give the A's, but this time it may be reversed a little bit. We'll see. Okay, so talk about medical tourism. Medical tourism is the travel of patients from one country, the home country, to another country, the destination country, for the primary purpose of securing care. Very lucrative, very growing, very unregulated industry. Often there are facilitators who are people who help you choose to go to a facility, arrange your evaluation, guide the documents back and forth, maybe also organize some touring. And these people really vary in their sophistication. Some of them are multinational corporations. Others, and these are real people I've met, are travel agents from Florida who happen to have a couple of down years and decided this was a good way to kind of supplement their industry. A lot of the industry is facilitated through the internet. This is a very typical facilitator website. Here's another one, a little bit more glamorous. So the industry sells an image of glamorous, right? It cultivates the idea of concierge medicine, beautiful beaches. And although it's called medical tourism, some people think that's pejorative. In reality, actually, a lot of the times it is bundled with some kind of tourism activity. A trip to the Taj Mahal, a safari after your cosmetic surgery. It turns out the giraffes don't mind very much. And I've always found this to be kind of a funny ad. Like, is the implication that the surgery is going to be performed on the pontoon in the middle of the blue? I don't know. But it really is kind of conveying this notion of luxury and the like. So I did a book a couple of years ago on the industry. This is the publisher hawking the book slide, right? Great for Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, whatever you like. But in reality, I think it's better to kind of divide the industry in a couple of ways. This, by the way, in the bottom is Bumrungrad in Thailand, which is probably the industry leader. It looks like nothing so much as a Marriott conference hotel if you look at it. But actually, beautiful facility and has all sorts of interesting things like an entire wing devoted to halal patients as a way to try to attract people from the Arab world. So to understand the phenomenon, it's useful to divide the industry by a few ways. The first is by the legal status of the treatment. There are treatments for services that are illegal in both the patient's home and destination countries, hip replacements, cardiac bypass, cosmetic surgery. Then there's medical tourism for services that are illegal in both the patient's home and destination country, but is facilitated to do it in the destination country because of laxer enforcement. Kidney transplant tourism is probably the best example of this. Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, lots of these places. Then in the middle is a category of medical tourism for services that are illegal in a patient's home country, but legal in the destination country. And patients are traveling to try to avoid domestic regulation. I call it circumvention tourism. So travel from Portugal or Poland for an abortion, travel to Zurich for assisted suicide, stem cell therapies, travel to the United States for reproductive technologies, for example, and quite interesting. The second division is just based on who pays. So we can talk about who's paying for these kinds of procedures. You have patients who are paying out of pocket. This will almost always involve patients paying out of pocket. People who are going for circumvention tourism, for the illegal stuff, almost always paying out of pocket. But the same may also be true of patients who are purchasing services that are illegal in their home country in some cases. In the United States, the uninsured represent one large group who may find medical tourism an attractive way of covering healthcare costs, particularly across to the Mexico border. And the most recent United States Census estimated that approximately 50 million United States residents were uninsured in 2010. Since the Affordable Care Act, that number has dipped to about 30 million, although many will be undocumented immigrants who will not be covered by the ACA. These individuals may consider medical tourism for non-emergency care, in part because of the cost savings. So to illustrate, and all the numbers in this industry are soft, there is no good data collection, but I would say this is probably right to an order of magnitude. Okay. So here is an example. We'll just take one of the lines. We'll take heart bypass. Retail price, if you're paying out of pocket, $210,000 for your bypass. Doesn't mean the hospital will collect that amount of money from you, but this is kind of what you're paying. Your insurer is going to pay about half of that, $94,000. You go to India, Thailand, Singapore, you're talking $10,000 to $20,000. And in general, this is a good rule of thumb, that you can basically pay, if you go abroad to some of these places, 20% of the cost of your surgery that you would pay at home if you were paying out of pocket. So for somebody who's uninsured, that's a huge cost savings. This chart, a little more data, looks across the world in general, and you'll see cost savings are less if you're coming from Europe. They pay less for these things, but still substantial. Okay. So a second category has to do with underinsured individuals. These people who have health insurance, but their plans have high deductibles, exclusions, co-pays, and it's still in their interest to go abroad for this kind of care and pay out of pocket. Beyond the uninsured and underinsured, outside the United States, we have individuals who are basically trying to queue jump, right? So these are individuals who have long waiting lists in the UK and Canada, for example, hip replacement, MRI, unwilling to wait the length of time it will take to get seen by the national healthcare system and traveling abroad for something else. Then we've got individuals whose travel is paid for and whose procedures are paid for by private insurers. So believe it or not, you can be fully insured in the United States and have a health insurance product, and the private insurer will essentially try to induce you to travel abroad so it can have some of those savings. If we return to the data I showed you a moment ago, we can see that the U.S. health insurer pays less for a hip replacement if it sends a patient to India, for example. And it can afford to pocket those savings, give some of it back to the patient, and still make a healthy profit if you can induce someone to do this. So let me give a real example. ABC News covered this example. In North Carolina, we've got Joy. She weighs 238 pounds. She's 5'9". She has severe chronic obesity, family history of diabetes, heart disease. She needs gastric sleeve surgery. She worked for HSM, a furniture and auto parts manufacturer in western North Carolina. Gary, 65, also worked for them. He needed a knee replacement. What they had in common was their employer, HSM, induced them to leave North Carolina and travel to Costa Rica for their treatment at the same hospital, the hospital Clinica Biblica. Even with their insurance, these were insured individuals. Both Harwell and Guion would have paid about $3,000 out of pocket, an amount she said she would be unable to afford. But in Costa Rica, they paid nothing. The company picks up the tab. company pays for their travel. The company gives them days off. The company pays for the travel of a loved one. And on top of all that, the company gives them a bonus check for at least $2,500 and a percentage of the corporate savings and insurance costs that would be offered. So that's a huge inducement to somebody who's just getting by to go abroad to do this. Outsourcing medical care saved the company nearly $10 million in healthcare costs over 5 years. Close to 250 of its employees have taken advantage of this program. So in the United States, her and your place would have been much more expensive. So the company gains by doing this, the individual gains, and it's consensual. She could have said no, turned down the money, but she didn't. You begin to wonder what would have happened if something had gone wrong, what she would have been able to do about medical malpractice. If we talk about the civil procedural aspects in the Q&A if people are interested. The third category is mostly in Europe, which is that in Europe, actually public insurers, home country governments, will sometimes be required to pay for individuals to go abroad. We have a new European directive that's being transposed into law that requires this. And it's quite interesting. There's a significant amount of cross-EU medical tourism for waiting list reasons, for quality of care and sophistication of provider reasons, and also for retirement reasons. People retire in a different member state from their member state of origin. Okay. Divide it up one more way, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect of this medical tourism. So the third way of dividing this up is by patient flow. Although it's described as north and south, actually these are linguistic markers for actually north typically means high income in this division, and south means lower middle income countries. I mean, Australia is a high income north country, even though on the map it doesn't look that north to me, right? Some of the travel that's got a lot of attention is north-south, so from America to India, Bangkok, places like that. But in fact, there's a significant amount of south-north medical tourism. The Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, we've been a large repository for this. And there's also interregional forms of medical tourism. Okay. So what's the effect of this kind of medical tourism what's the impact of this kind of medical tourism on the destination country? So in a place like India or Thailand, what does this glut of Americans and other Western individuals traveling there do to healthcare availability? This is a significant and difficult set of questions, difficult to measure. It's an empirical question, and the answer is going to vary country by country, not only depending on its internal healthcare economy, but also what steps it takes to protect, and also to protect its healthcare access in that country, the amount of corruption there, the tax system, and the way trickle-down does or does not occur. So in general, we can't say anything firm about this, but I think it's useful to talk about some vectors. So what are the things that will cause diminutions in healthcare access in these places? I think there's 6 factors to talk about. The first is that the healthcare services consumed by medical tourists come from those that would otherwise have been available to the destination country poor. When medical tourists seek travel abroad for cardiac care, hip replacements, other forms of surgery being used by the destination country poor, there's a pretty straightforward siphoning effect. By contrast, the destination country poor are already unlikely to be able to access things like reproductive technologies, some boutique forms of treatment, cosmetic surgery, stem cell, and fertility therapies. But over a period of time, if your country begins to specialize in offering these services to tourists, your residency spots, your medical education, your workforce shifts into those areas. So over the long term, even if it's an area that there's a mismatch between what the tourists want and what your population wants, you still may have this effect. Second vector, the healthcare providers and resources are captured by the medical tourist patient population rather than serving some tourist clientele and some of the existing populations. So absent regulation, the introduction of a higher paying market of American or other Western medical tourists is going to cause healthcare providers to shift away from the local populace towards that population. In Thailand, for example, Laura Hopkins observes that almost 6,000 positions for medical practitioner in the public system remain unfilled in 2005. An increasing number of them are demanding higher wages and shifting towards the medical tourism facilities. It's worth emphasizing here that losing physicians and other resources from the public to the private sector is not unique to the developing world or to medical tourism. This is also the impact of when private options are introduced in countries that have national health care. For example, in Canada and France, although in those countries there's regulations often put in place to require individuals to spend a certain amount of time in both systems, or to say there's only so many slots for this kind of professional in the private system, or to say you either have to go completely private or completely public. So there are ways you can cope as a healthcare system with this dynamic. Third, there's a question about whether the supply of healthcare professionals, facilities, technologies in the destination country is elastic or inelastic. Theoretically, if you're increasing demand, supply should catch up. People should move into the market. But it turns out when it comes to medical education, medical credentialing, medical training, we and most developed countries have a hard time actually adjusting our production of these things, certainly in the short and middle term. Maybe in the long term we're a little bit better. Okay, 3 other factors. Fourth factor, do the positive effects of medical tourism in counteracting the external brain drain of healthcare practitioners to foreign countries, are they outweighed by the negative effects of medical tourism on the availability of healthcare resources? In a moment, I'm going to talk about medical migration, but the hope is when you establish a robust, well-oiled, well-financed, high-tech medicine practice in your country, you stave off people who would leave your country to travel to a place like the United States, Canada, the UK to do that. That is the hope. The reality, though, is that the source countries for medical migration, outgoing, providing doctors, don't always line up with the destination countries for medical tourism. And the more of a mismatch there is, the more it is the case that a medical tourism will not help stave off medical migration. Fifth factor, medical tourism prompts destination country governments to redirect healthcare resources away from basic healthcare services in a way that outweighs positive healthcare spillovers. In order to compete in this market internationally for foreign patients, you've got to invest. You've got to build high-tech facilities, you've got to have training, you've got to build the equipment, and you've got to finance it. That money doesn't come from nowhere. In some cases, it comes from tertiary healthcare, from public healthcare systems. Now, again, in theory, this is not the way the dynamic has to go. You could have positive spillovers. People are learning high-tech skills from this part of the industry. It's generating excitement and training and equipment, and that material is being used to train the general populace. But to the extent, in fact, we're seeing redirection and a competition for resources, and the money is not coming from outside sources, but instead coming from the public health system, we're likely to see diminutions in healthcare access. Last one. Profits from the medical tourism industry are unlikely to trickle down. So do the profits of the industry make their way back into the pockets of the local populace, or do they not? This may depend on things like how progressive is the tax system, how much corruption is there, how much tax reporting, but also issues about foreign ownership. How much of the industry is actually owned by the people who are being served here in the government versus being owned by private investors. So, for example, Thailand made up to $1.35 billion in profits from medical tourism in 2007. Approximately 84% were from healthcare provision, the rest coming from tourism. The same year, Singapore made $1.2 billion, and Malaysia $78 million. But the question is, does that money make it back into the hands of the destination country poor, or instead are we making destination country middle and upper class individuals rich while making healthcare access for the destination poor worse? Okay, medical tourism. Second topic, medical migration. So I'm a Canadian by birth, like the Dean, so I'm allowed to pick a little bit on the country I've lived in the last 15 years, the U.S., but I could actually use any major industrialized Western country as my example, but I'll use the U.S. The U.S. depends very heavily on foreign-trained doctors to staff its healthcare system. In 2005, about a fifth of all doctors practicing in the U.S. were foreign-trained. That recruitment has devastating impacts on healthcare availability in many places in the world. To use just a very explicit example, between 86 and 95, 61% of all graduates of the Ghana Medical School left the country for employment. 54.9% of those to the US, to the UK, 35.4% to the United States. So you're talking about decimating the availability of doctors in a place like Ghana by the fact that we are able to recruit, retain, give them immigration status here in the US and the UK. This has the effect of creating essentially a subsidization from the developing world to the developed world, from the poor to the rich. A study estimated that roughly 3 million currently practicing healthcare professionals were trained in less developed countries, had migrated to more developed countries. It would have cost an average of $184,000 to treat them in the developing world, such that poor countries lost $500 million in their training costs, and we made a lot more of that in terms of having these people be in the United States. The most recent WHO data from 2008 indicates that the ratio of physicians per 1,000 population in Mozambique is 0.03. 0.03 physicians for every 1,000 members of the population, whereas in Sweden or Spain, it's above the number 3. So 3 versus 0.03 in terms of the comparison we're talking about. This has a dramatic effect on the quality of healthcare availability. And just to focus on a really dramatic case, Ebola, although I don't want to mislead you, actually the day-to-day infectious diarrhea, these kinds of things kill many more people. But Ebola is very much in our minds right now, so let me just use that as an example. The countries most affected by Ebola rank the lowest in global development, lacking public health infrastructure, the most basic of which is an adequate workforce. The WHO estimates there's a $7.2 million doctor shortage of nurses, midwives globally. And even before the loss of lives, Liberia and Sierra Leone had only about 90 and 136 doctors, respectively, in the entire country, right? So imagine how to deal with a global health outbreak in a place where you have 90 doctors total, and those people are on the front line getting infected with an agent like Ebola. This is just the tip of the iceberg if you think about laboratories, public health, clinical personnel. In all these things, these countries are deficient. But when it comes to physicians and nurses, we are, in very many ways, siphoning away people who would have worked in those countries to come work for us. But there's another side of the story, and I want to show both sides. And that is the people involved. So Laura Fercoli and Pablo Delora, for example, discuss the story of Abraham Verghese, an acclaimed writer who was born to Ethiopian parents of Indian origin, trained as a doctor, was born in Ethiopia. He was raised as an Orthodox Syrian Christian, trained in Ethiopia, the United States, and India. He completed his medical education and moved to the United States to practice, and he put it, and I'm quoting him now, "Sir, craving your indulgence, I want to train in a decent 10-story hospital where the lifts are actually working. I want to pass board certification exams by my own merit, not through pull of bribes. I want to become a doctor, practice real medicine, pay taxes, make a good living, drive a car on decent roads, and eventually live in the Ansel Adams section of New Mexico and never come back to this wretched town." Right? So this is, quoting him, this is what he says. But don't we all want to choose our own career path? Don't we all want a livelihood, to feel like we're being effective, to be treated well? What about our rights to travel? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 13.2, states that individuals have a moral right to leave any country, including their own. Article 15.2 says that no individual shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to change his or her nationality. Hence, individuals have a right to renounce their home country nationality. There's also the complication of remittances, which are sent back from the doctor to his family and may improve the life not only of his family back home, but more generally the society. And there's lots of complex questions about this. Are the remittances used for consumption in the immediate time frame or investment? How do they interface with foreign exchange constraints? How much diffusion is there from remittances to his family versus the entirety of the society? Migration, though, can also lead to what's called brain circulation, as opposed to brain drain. You return home to your homeland, contributing to the economy of that country with an enhanced skill set, set of knowledge, and established networks in the destination countries. And even if you don't stay there, you may have trained 3 other people who do. So we've got an empirical mess here, I think even more so than medical tourism, to ask whether migration, certainly the effect on the workforce of physicians, decimates it. But in terms of the actual welfare of the population, when you factor in brain circulation and remittances, hard to say. And I think what's interesting is that it's distributional within the sending country. For the very poor, probably an overall loss. For the middle class, lower middle class, upper class, the remittances probably are a huge impact in terms of the GDP and the spending in that country. There are options here. We could prohibit people from leaving. That's the most draconian, you might say, would violate some of the human rights documents. You could have conditional scholarships that say you take money from the government to be studying medical school, you have to give 5 or 6 years here. Does that look like a good idea or like indentured servitude? Is there some conception that there should be a tax on the countries that are recruiting and employing these people and paid back in such a way? But how do you figure out those taxes? And can individuals who are going to a place like the Mayo Clinic or the best hospital in the United States, they can probably afford to pay out whatever the golden handcuffs they have on them from the state is. So are we really thinking that the money is quite fungible here to the workforce, or do we think it's quite different? Okay, one more example, and this is medical repatriation. So this is transferring usually uninsured alien patients with significant long-term care needs to facilities abroad. No one officially tracks it, but there's no doubt it happens. There's a study by Seton Hall School of Law, looked at 6 years, 15 different states, so there was about 800 medical repatriations during this time. Now, most of the repatriations are undocumented, so chances are that's just the tip of the iceberg. Don't have a lot of data, so let me share some narratives instead. First, the story of Fidel Delgado. He arrives at St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, in need of emergency care for a heart attack. They perform bypass surgery, save his life. He's got an unpaid bill of $837,950. The staff informs Delgado's family that they would be sending him back to Mexico. He's still in need of extensive medical care for which Medicaid would not pay because he's an undocumented alien. Although he's undocumented, he's lived in the United States for over 40 years, and his wife is a U.S. citizen. He has no relatives in Mexico, and his sister worries, quote, he's going to die if he has to go back to Mexico, unquote. St. Joseph sends an average of 7 immigrants a month back to their home country, often over the patient's objection and the objection of the family members. The hospital says that the policy changes have forced it to transfer more immigrants to their native country when they require long-term care and lack insurance. Another story. Antonio, a Mexican native, comes to the United States. He obtains a visa to live and work in the U.S. While living there, a car accident, severe brain injury, bruised lung, other abdominal injuries. Taken to a hospital and placed on a ventilator to keep him alive in a comatose-like state. The hospital quickly reached the conclusion there's little to be done for him. It was suggested that he be unplugged from the ventilator. His parents refused to give up their son, reject the hospital's suggestion. The hospital explained to his parents that because he was an immigrant that had not been in the United States for the required 5-year period, he's not eligible for federal financial assistance to pay for medical care. He doesn't have private health insurance, but through his work, since he was a farm laborer, can't cover the medical costs. He and his family could not pay for the out-of-pocket care. Days after the hospital announced their decision to send him back to Mexico, he was sent back to Mexico in a comatose state. The driving force of this desire to send these people back has to do with a gap in our social safety net, right? These hospitals lack funds for emergency care for these patients, right? On the other hand, the law, EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, requires them to treat and stabilize any patient who comes in, at least for the sake of transfer, right? So essentially, when an alien comes in and needs long-term medical care, the hospital is unable to transfer the patient to another facility in the United States. Who wants to take a patient like this who can't pay, right, but who's costing huge amounts of dollars day by day? What are they supposed to do? Well, many of them make the decision to send the patient back to their home country in an attempt to avoid paying for this. Significant debate about the legality and ethics about this. One ethicist, for example, has argued that, quote, I believe there are 3 conditions, if met, can preserve the mission and values of hospital through the repatriation. The conditions are, 1, a transfer must be able to be seen by a reasonable person as being in the patient's best interest aside from the issue of reimbursement. For many, this will mean that the patient perceives the country to which he is being returned as a home place where he will have appropriate or potentially desirable social support. 2, the hospital must exercise due diligence regarding the medical support available to the patient's destination. And 3, the patient or appropriate surrogate gives full informed consent to the transfer. Okay, so all that sounds pretty shocking, right? You're like, comatose people are being sent away from our country. But again, there's another side to the story, and I think it's important to tell both sides, right? So first of all, by saying that we're going to require consent in every case, and it's going to be unethical to do it otherwise, that kind of masquerades as a middle solution when, in fact, you're essentially never going to transfer patients outside of the United States in these circumstances. Why should medical repatriation be treated differently from regular deportation? When someone is unlawfully in the United States, we don't ask them their consent before we transfer them back to their home country, right? We instead feel that we have lawfully the right to deport them. And before I get some glares at me or suggestion that I'm making a huge Trump-like mistake in making this argument, let me make clear that the structure of the argument I'm offering is about symmetry. It could be solved by leveling up, requiring consent for all deportations, medical or otherwise, or leveling down, requiring for none, medical or otherwise. But why treat this particular category of medical deportation as so different from other kinds of deportation? Notice, by the way, that in the case of the seriously ill individual, there's an argument that their deportation may be more justified than in other instances, even on the core basis for why people want to have human rights advocates and immigration rights advocates want to avoid deportation. It's harder to argue that these individuals are in serious and ongoingly poor health states. Hard to say they're enriching our social fabric going forward, especially in the economic sense. They're much more obviously a drain. Most immigrants pay into healthcare and social services more than they take out, and they don't actually take a lot from it. On the other side, though, maybe you would think that these people have paid in more and we have a duty of solidarity, or because they're particularly vulnerable, that it's worse to deport these kinds of people than other kinds of people. There's also a bit of a zero-sum quality for it, because if the federal government and the state governments are not going to pay for it, the hospitals are. And when someone is taking up an ICU bed, it's not just a question of deporting them willy-nilly, but in some ways you can view this as a rationing problem and saying whether their claim, their entitlement claim, is rivalrous. Is it stronger or less strong than the claim of another citizen who wants access to the same goods? We could talk about the same thing when it comes to organ transplant lists, for example. And one can argue that all undocumented aliens should have a right to health care and a right to remain in the United States. But if that's the basis for the argument, you're chewing off a larger argumentative bite than merely just seeing this as an exceptional case that deserves exceptional condemnation. Okay. So I want to now shift a little bit to talk about global justice. I'm going to take a sip of water. I'm doing a lot of political stuff today. When I feel like the water should be here by the plant, and I should be reaching out for it. So I want to say that all of these dilemmas and all of these contexts require us to think a lot about global justice. And that's going to have a huge ramification with how we think about healthcare globalization. Without medical migration, our own healthcare would be considerably more expensive. Without medical tourism, some patients will not get healthcare in the United States, or it's not going to get it as expeditiously. How should we think about our responsibilities to the other, citizens of these countries that are sending physicians or destination countries for medical tourism? I want to suggest that by wrestling with these questions, we have to wrestle with one of the biggest debates in political theory at the moment, the question of global justice. What do we owe those not part of our nation state? This is not a group of political theorists or bioethicists. I'm going to tread somewhat gingerly on this terrain. We can talk more in the Q&A depending on your amount of interest. Now, one easy answer to this would be to say, this is not about global justice. This is about national self-interest, right? The United States should adopt the ethical, what might seem seemingly ethical perspective on each of these practices out of pure egotistical national self-interest. That would be nice if it were true, but at least in some of these cases, especially medical repatriation, likely medical migration, medical tourism is a little harder to tell. The national self-interest perspective will lead us to the result that I think intuitively many people think of as unethical. It'll mean that we should take as many of those doctors as we can, foreign trained, to our shores. It means we should send our patients over there when it's cheaper, and we should certainly deport those who are in comas, who are undocumented, who are taking a lot of these spaces. Now again, this is not to say in every case it's clear. You might think that actually equipping other countries with healthcare resources is very important to avoid terrorism, to avoid the outbreak of Ebola and other disorders, and that's true to a point. But it's certainly not going to lead you to think that all of these practices are terrible and ought to be heavily regulated. So my own view is that I think that if all you cared about was national self-interest, you would not think that any of these practices are particularly problematic. Instead, we need to start with a theory of global justice. We need to think that we owe something to these people, that national self-interest is the beginning of the conversation, but not the end of the conversation. And I want to suggest that there's two kind of, at a very high level, we can kind of think of three foundational questions about what you're trying to do with the theory of global justice. You can talk about disparities in access to health care for the general population between us and them. That's the inequality question. Are there inequalities? You can talk about the causation question. Do we have evidence that the practice, medical tourism, medical migration, causes deficits or worsens inequality? Call that the causation question. And finally, it sounds a little bit like standing, you have the redressability question. Irrespective of what caused the deficit, would regulation of this practice improve or lessen the inequality? So the inequality question is very easy to answer. The answer is we are very unequal to these places. These places have much more healthcare access, we have much more healthcare access and much more of everything than do these countries. On some approaches to this problem, that's kind of the beginning and the end of the conversation, right? Our obligations, the mere fact of inequality, huge inequality, humanitarian inequality, is enough to ground an obligation for us. The other set of theories, I call these inequality theories. The other set of theories focus on causation. Causation matters to them. It's more like torts and like obligation. We've done something, and now we have the obligation to make these people whole. Now, again, the theory of causation need not be, the narrow torts conception of it, but there has to be some kind of nexus between what we've done and why they're in a bad position. Notice that the inequality and causation theories have different nexus to the regulations as redress. On the inequality theory, the mere fact that you are worse off than I am is enough to give me a reason to pursue regulation to try to limit that gap and improve that gap. On the causation theory, the redress I'm trying to focus on, the regulation, will be more keyed to what causes the disparity in the first place and what role I have for the causation. There are mixed theories in the literature. Some people like Thomas Pogge have a robust conception of damage to human rights or diminution of human rights that kind of mix the two. It is a causation theory, but if your conception of what it means to damage someone else's human rights is large enough, and you think about issues of historical justice as a kind of causation, the causation and inequality theories kind of merge. Okay. Well, imagine I have to say I'm a much bigger fan of the causation theories. Largely, I don't know that this is so philosophical as much as it is pragmatic. You imagine an American politician or trying to convince an American politician telling him the reason why we should do all these things that will inevitably retard the interest of the United States is because of the huge inequality between us and these other places. That's just a tough sell to me, right? I think the causation story appeals to more intuitive conceptions of justice and harm that really form the backbone of the first-year classroom in the law school as well. So there's something that has to be intuitive about it. Well, separate from whether you believe in the causation or the addressability question, you have to take a position on what is the obligations of global justice. And here I think it's useful to kind of contrast three large schools. You've got strong cosmopolitans who think that the fact that you were born in America rather than Mozambique is a completely moral, arbitrary fact, and that all the good things about being an American that you enjoy are things you don't deserve, and all the things that they get of being in Mozambique that are bad is not something they deserve either, right? So me and my brother in Mozambique, there is nothing that separates us except moral luck and moral arbitrariness, and from that realization, there's a strong obligation to do all that we can. And these theories come in utilitarian, prioritarian, sufficientarian kinds of theories, and we can talk a little bit more. If this is your political theory, it's pretty easy to know what to do, right? The person who is comatose in the United States, who's an undocumented alien, should be treated just like every American, right? When I take a doctor from there to here, that is if I took a doctor from a poor area in the United States and brought them over here and worsened inequality. The moral arbitrariness of our borders is erased. It's also, though, an incredibly capacious theory of moral obligation. If you really took this seriously, most of us would have to give up almost all of what we have now as, in order to kind of make up the difference, right? That's what our moral obligation would be. So I think there is some interest, again, more pragmatically, on not relying on a cosmopolitan theory. And we can discuss whether philosophically cosmopolitan theories have them right. On the other side of the extreme are statist theories. Unlike cosmopolitan, statists think that the obligations of distributive justice only apply within the nation state, not to citizens of other nations. Their reasoning is that what lets citizens make redistributive claims on each other is not the fact that we share a cooperative structure, but that societal rules established with sovereign states' basic structure are coercively imposed, right? So the moral presumption against arbitrary inequalities is not a principle of universal application. This is Nagel. What is objectionable is that we should be fellow participants in a collective enterprise of coercively imposed legal and political institutions that generate such arbitrary inequalities. The complex fact that the societal rules establishing a sovereign state's basic structure, we are both joint authors of the coercively imposed system and subjects to its norms. That's what does it. So that would take you to a view that the nation state is the important unit of analysis for redistribution. Although, even within those theories, there are some resources for thinking that we ought to do more. Nagel has an idea of humanitarian duties, that in humanitarian crises, we may have duties that are not truly redistributive, but they are duties to help someone for easy rescue in a humanitarian deficit, right? Rawls has a conception of burdened states and helping to guide burdened states. But it's not clear that all of the examples of globalization will fit easily into either of these two categories. And then in the middle, which is the one that I'm the most partial to, is intermediate theories, and we can talk about them. Intermediate theories are intermediate in two ways. First of all, they say that we may have something less than full-blown duties of distributive justice, but more than the minimal duties of humanitarian aid. Instead, there may be an obligation to treat those in the outside of our nation state as counting for something, not nothing, even if we don't give them the exact same counting that we give ourselves. They're also more open to what I'll call coercion light, the idea of the actions of international bodies like the WTO or the ILO, these kinds of bodies that's very hard not to join, that have coercive impacts even though you are theoretically free to join them, that increasing systems of economic interdependence may put upon us obligations. So again, it's not all the way to the cosmopolitans, where the mere fact that you and I are unequal, even if we have no connection to one another, you're all the way over there, theoretically our society has never interacted. The mere fact of arbitrary inequality is enough to generate an obligation there. For intermediate theorists, there has to be more going on, but it doesn't have to just be the boundaries of the nation state. It doesn't have to be pure coercion, pure joint subject, joint author. It can be something more capacious. And in examples like the brain drain, you might think the way in which the International Monetary Fund's historical requirement that countries like Cameroon make cutbacks in their publicly funded healthcare system. You might think GATS. You might think trade agreements, that all of these are doing enough of a bridging work to create a nexus. But again, this kind of analysis is going to be specific. You're going to look at each of the examples of medical globalization or globalization in general and see whether they're enough to generate an intermediate duty or not. And my own kind of sympathies are with these types of theories, and we talk a little bit more why in the Q&A. Well, let me come to a close. Where does this leave us? So medical migration and medical tourism in particular offer both opportunities to patients, to physicians, to destination and home countries, but real concerns as well in terms of their effects on worsening inequalities, which are already great between developed and developing world. There are technical questions. If our goal is to reduce medical migration, what's the most effective way to do it? I don't want to make it sound like these questions are not difficult ones. They're very difficult. They require balancing human rights to travel, for example, and assume new nationalities against basic access to healthcare and the state's role in fostering medical education. But to my mind, like most interesting questions in life, there's an X and Y kind of structure. If X, then Y. That's a very typical structure in philosophy and law. If you want to deter medical migration, then do the following. But should, that's the X part, you want to discourage medical migration, medical tourism, medical repatriation. In order to answer those questions, I think it's impossible to answer those questions without an encounter with global justice theory. And my own sympathies lie with the intermediate global justice theory. But whatever your sympathies are, you've got to have a theory. And you've got to have a way of talking about the theory pragmatically that can translate it into the policy sphere. Unless and until we get clear in our heads what our obligations are to those outside of our nation state under what circumstances, we cannot hope to answer the questions about what our policy should be on these topics. And we cannot hope to help stymie the huge amounts of health disparities and health problems occurring across the world, of which recent encounters with Ebola and Zika and the like are just the tip of the iceberg. So thank you very much. I look forward to the questions. So I'm told somebody has a mic, and they will bring it out. You're not supposed to ask questions until the mic is there because they want to record them. So I saw one question over there on the far right, and then a question over here. Let's go with this man in the red sweater first. Go first, sir. And then we can do the next one.
The first question, I think one of the more dramatic things was that chart about the disparities.
Yep.
And I guess I just kind of an econometric question.
Yep.
If by chance that it was instead of 10 or 20 times higher in the United States, it was only 5, and kind of in the econometric, how much would this overall problem be reduced? Because that's certainly what's driving exponentially this, and I'm just curious from your background just how much of what this curve would look like in some sense.
So it depends a lot on the trade you're talking about. From the United States, so first thing to know about it is only about 30% of Americans have passports. So most Americans have never traveled outside of the United States in their entire life. What it takes to induce them to go abroad is probably significantly dependent on what the cost differential will be. Much of the current what we know about the people who travel back and forth, and it's kind of a patchy sort of data, it's not as quantitative as we like, a lot of it is people who have an origin or a family origin outside of the United States returning to that place for that activity. So, for example, I know many people who actually fund their vacations home by getting the dentistry done in the home country and pocketing the money and using that as a difference. And that's not hip replacement, knee replacement, cardiac bypass. But in general, I think that to the extent these differences shrunk, you would see from the United States a significant diminution in the amount of people interested in this. Outside of the U.S., we're talking about more of the regional travel, for example, from Indonesia to Malaysia, or the travel from south to north, right? So from the Gulf states to the United States for the Mayo Clinic. Already there, the differentials work in the opposite direction, right? They're paying 5 times more when it comes to that. So I don't think that particular trade would be much affected by, but it depends a little bit on whether they leveled up or leveled down. Our prices went down or their prices went up. But I do think that people are price sensitive. And there was one paper by Milstein, I can't remember where it's published, maybe Health Affairs or JAMA, where they gave hypothetical surveys to individuals and offered them different amounts of cost savings and looked to see how much cost savings would be required to get someone to travel. And it does scale to some extent. There was a question over here first. Yep.
Hi, thank you for a really fascinating presentation. Looking at this chart prompts me to ask, it might be a slightly tangential question, and that is, why is Singapore able to provide a heart valve replacement at 20 times less the cost? It makes me wonder, is the medical care as good? And if so, what does that say about our medical care system? And what is why? I could understand some differential, but that vast differential, I think, also reflects on the cost of healthcare here. And to what do you attribute that?
Yeah, even compared to other OECD countries, our healthcare is significantly much more expensive, but it's even more expensive than other places. So, a couple things. On the quality question, huge variations in the heterogeneity of care, even for a foreign market. So in India, there are hospitals that do cardiac bypass, and that's all they do, right? So they specialize in this. They have very much an assembly line process of doing it, and their morbidity and mortality estimates are as good as the Mayo Clinic. You also have other places where, in the world where there's rampant kind of infection and the like, you have people returning from transplant in very immunocompromised states, in real trouble, rejection, and the like. So huge heterogeneity. Although, by the way, there's also huge heterogeneity in the United States. If you look actually at the map, like the Dartmouth Atlas, and look at all the healthcare in the United States, you'll find huge differences between these. And in the United States, everybody is accredited by the Joint Commission, right? They're receiving Medicare and Medicaid dollars. So we have a baseline level of accreditation, and yet we have huge variation. Abroad, there is an accreditation institution called the Joint Commission International, which does a similar accreditation of foreign hospitals. Often countries will pick 2 or 3 of their hospitals in that country to go for that accreditation because it's an expensive kind of process. So that's some guide to quality, but very few of these countries and these hospitals will share the morbidity and mortality data with us. So just in general, quality is a big question mark, although that's true in the United States as well. In terms of why the costs are so dramatic. So again, all these numbers always should be taken with a grain of salt. And I'll also say that even though this is the U.S. retail price, as one of the examples I gave you suggested, nobody ever pays it because it turns out hospitals' ability to actually get you to pay this is kind of, if you're not an insured individual, is compromised. It's hard for them to actually, usually they'll cut a deal, a side deal, and you'll pay less than that. And in general, actually, there's some interesting stuff in the New York Times recently. It's almost impossible. If you go in for a surgery and try to figure out how much it's going to cost you paying out of pocket ahead of time, the hospital will not be able to tell you. There's so many elements in terms of bringing in a surgeon who's an independent contractor, the cost of the anesthesiologist. But why are the healthcare costs so much greater in this country than elsewhere? So one answer is that in a place like India, for example, all the inputs of healthcare are cheaper. The orderlies, the sheets, the nurses, the rent on the facility, the cost of the medical education, the wages paid to the physicians. All of these are less than they are in the United States. The other thing is that in some of these places, the system of care is designed differently. So to use India again as an example, patients' families provide a lot more of the care, traditionally done by the healthcare team in the United States, the post-operative care in particular, in a place like India. And the third reason is that many of these places just develop systems of medicine that are much more specialized, right? The same person does the same part of the surgery over and over and over again, right? And the medicine is done much more like an assembly line than it is here in the United States. So all of these go to contribute. But even as compared to our OECD countries, our peer countries that have nationalized healthcare systems, we don't have a single regulator bargaining with doctors or paying with doctors. Instead, we have kind of managed competition, oligopoly. We have health insurers competing with one another and hospitals competing with one another. Results in different price dynamics. Last thing I'll say is that healthcare expenditures in general, not so much these charts, but in general, the U.S. subsidizes the intellectual property of the entire world, right? We pay the most for drugs, we get them first. But actually, if you look at how drugs are priced across the world, priced much higher in the United States, much lower elsewhere in the world. So there's a subsidization from our healthcare spending to elsewhere. Please.
Yes, I'm just wondering, culturally it seems like we're in a time, particularly for blue-collar, lower middle-class folks, where we're supporting isolationist candidates for president, we're supporting, and political candidates in general. There's a culture of looking inward. There's a culture of buy U.S. So it seems to me that, you talked about the stories of those two individuals who were kind of co-opted by their employer into going to Costa Rica. And I'm curious if there's any work that you know of that's being done where, I can't see a whole lot of people in certain populations doing this on their own, even if they get a vacation out of it. And so if there's any work that you know about the growth of medical tourism that's going to come through employer subsidization?
Yes, so I think the employer-sponsored side, a lot of people have flirted with it, some have tried it. What often has happened in some of the cases, there's a case involving the Hannaford Brothers supermarkets in the Northeast. Company will announce that they're about to do this, and their local insurer will offer them a cut on the rates they would have paid. So it's sometimes been used as a bargaining chip to actually get local insurance rates be lowered. So that's one thing about it. The other thing to realize at the insurance side of it is unless you're a self-insured employer, so if you're not a self-insured employer, you are bound by all the insurance regulation in your state. If you're self-insured, ERISA, turns out ERISA does a lot of different things. It's a very complicated statute, preempts a lot of local health insurance regulation. So a lot of the existing healthcare regulation of insurance meant to actually capture HMOs and PPOs, preferred provider organization, ends up ruling this out anyways, not because they're intending to do it, but by accident. But a larger share of healthcare in the United States is being offered by employer-sponsored plans. This section of the market, the one that's basically private insurer prompted, hard to know how big it is, hard to know how much bigger it's going to get. And in part, this is a reaction to the Affordable Care Act. With the Affordable Care Act, many more people have private health insurance in general. So the first market, patients paying out of pocket, likely to shrink. On the other hand, many people are buying plans that are high deductible, high copay. So more people are going to be underinsured. And then also undocumented aliens are the number one level of uninsured individuals in the United States after the ACA. Many of them will still go to Mexico. And finally, more employers that are now having to pick up health insurance are interested in lower cost health insurance projects. So in theory, this market should be shifting, I think, from fewer in the top to more in the middle category. But that's a theoretical kind of claim of what I would expect. Very little data that I know of being able to suggest this. And in fact, in many of the local markets, someone suggests it, they examine, they go some of the way there, but they don't pull the trigger in the end, one reason or another.
Thank you.
Yep, there's a question over here. Sorry to make you run all the way over there. Have me in the middle, that's kind of nice.
So you mentioned this earlier, but in terms of opportunity for redress in terms of malpractice, so I'm wondering, is any part of the cost gradient due to the fact that if I go to Costa Rica, I may not be able to recover against my provider if they botch my surgery?
It's a good question, right? So can't recover because lack of personal jurisdiction, forum non-convenience objection. Choice of law means Thai, Mexican, Indian, Singaporean law, much less remunerative, and difficulties of enforcing a judgment. It's a first-year civil procedure exam in the making, right? So all that is true. But that said, right, so it turns out that if you look at medical malpractice, the direct cost of medical malpractice system, very small. The effect on the practice of defensive medicine, potentially significantly larger or plausibly significantly larger. but nowhere near 80%, right? Maybe 3 to 4 to 5% is what's doing the work if we had zero malpractice. But these countries do have malpractice systems and other forms of regulation. So hard to think that the gap is being made up mostly by medical malpractice differences. There is an interesting, by the way, and again, this is a puzzle, I think. In the U.S., are you allowed to waive your medical malpractice insurance? Let's say you want to go to someone, a doctor, and say, if you give me a haircut on the price, take that down from $210,000 to $240,000, I'll waive my medical malpractice claim against you in advance. No, unenforceable by law. Yet people who travel abroad are de facto kind of waiving these because the ability to enforce a claim against medical malpractice against a foreign provider is so much weaker. So it's sort of interesting that we have one doctrine preventing the contractual waiver, but we're allowing the de facto waiver by travel. But you might just say that's like going bungee jumping in Costa Rica as well. You've essentially waived whatever tort claims you're going to have on the back end.
Please join me in thanking Professor Cohen.